I think that the red herring and so forth is rather ridiculous to toss into this conversation.
And are you a Marxist?
Well, I have studied Marxist philosophy, yes, sir, and also other philosophers.
But are you a Marxist? I think you did admit on an earlier radio interview that you consider yourself a Marxist.
Oh, I would very definitely say that I am a Marxist. That is correct.
The Warren Commission report conclusively established that this man, Lee Harvey Oswald, killed President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. An historic recording, Oswald's own statements, recorded 93 days before the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The recording of the Conversation Carte Blanche program, reproduced in an album by Inca, provides the Warren Commission with a remarkable tool to aid in its efforts to discover the facts about Lee Harvey Oswald. In Washington, Warren Commission member Congressman Hale Boggs says,
"Ladies and gentlemen, this is an historic recording. It served the Warren Commission well, as it did the American people, those men of goodwill all over the world who honestly seek the truth. It conclusively establishes from Oswald's own statements, and not from mere rumor, speculation, or conjecture, what Oswald stood for and his mental condition shortly before the tragedy of November 22nd, 1963.
Was he a hired killer, a communist agent, or was he just a lunatic? Oswald's life and the story of the horror he brought to the world begins in New Orleans, often called the city that care forgot. It is here that teenaged Oswald is given his introduction to communism through a booklet about the Rosenberg atom spies. It is here he finds a book which he says makes him feel like a very religious man, opening the Bible for the first time. Oswald leaves New Orleans to live in the Soviet Union. Claiming dissatisfaction with living conditions in the Soviet Union, he writes to United States government officials demanding financial assistance to return to America with his beautiful Russian wife and child. In New Orleans again, he establishes a chapter of the so-called Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Carrying in his pocket a Fair Play for Cuba membership card, he begins to distribute the organization's literature on the street corners of New Orleans. The news department of a New Orleans radio and television station, WDSU-TV, brings to the public the opposing views of the thousands of Cuban refugees who have settled in New Orleans and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, represented by Lee Harvey Oswald.
I think that the red herring and so forth is rather ridiculous to toss into this conversation.
And are you a Marxist?
Well, I have studied Marxist philosophy, yes, sir, and also other philosophers.
But are you a Marxist? I think you did admit on an earlier radio interview that you consider yourself a Marxist.
Oh, I would very definitely say that I am a Marxist. That is correct. But that does not mean, however, that I'm a communist.
What is the difference between the two?
Well, there's a great deal of difference. Several American parties in several countries are based on Marxism, such as Ghana. Certain countries have characteristics of a socialist system, such as Great Britain with its socialized medicine. These, then, are the differences between an outright communist country and countries which adhere to leftist or Marxist principles.
In your work with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, what are you advocating?
We advocate restoration of diplomatic, trade, and tourist relations with Cuba.
Arrangements are made to present on the station's Conversation Carte Blanche program a debate between Oswald and an official of INCA, INCA, the Information Council of the Americas. It is on this program, broadcast only 93 days before the assassination of President Kennedy, that Oswald confronts the only free world propaganda specialist he is ever to meet in open debate. The man, Edward Scannell Butler, who conceived and serves as executive vice president of Inca, a far-flung private communications network supplying programs called truth tapes to 130 radio stations in 16 Latin American nations and over 300 stations in the United States.
The Oswald you are about to hear is a young man I will never forget. A young man most Americans still know little about.
Fair Play for Cuba Committee believe that this trend should also be copied in the United States?
No, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is occupied only with the Cubans.
Thank you very much.
Edward
Mr.
Butler
Oswald.
comments on his observations of Oswald prior to the Conversation Carte Blanche program and tells of the events of that fateful night at the radio station.
When I met Oswald in the WDSU studios, I already knew a good deal about him. I'd heard this long tape-recorded interview he'd given reporter Bill Stuckey. I'd also gotten the story of his pro-Castro demonstration from refugee Carlos Bringuier. I'd read his anti-American propaganda and had gathered data on his defection to Russia, which, up to that time, he had not revealed in New Orleans. In the studios, Carlos Bringuier, moderator Bill Stuckey, and WDSU newsman Bill Slatter, Oswald, and myself sat around a small studio table. I sat on Oswald's left, less than a foot away. After introducing Oswald and describing the pro-Castro activities of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, Stuckey said,
Mr. Butler brought some newspaper clippings to my attention, and I also found some through an independent investigation, Washington newspaper clippings to the effect that Mr. Oswald had attempted to renounce his American citizenship in 1959 and become a Soviet citizen. There was another clipping dated 1952 saying that Mr. Oswald had returned from the Soviet Union with his wife and child after having lived there for 3 years. Mr. Oswald, are these correct?
That is correct, yes.
You did live in Russia for 3 years?
That is correct, and I think the fact that I did live for a time in the Soviet Union gives me excellent qualifications to repudiate charges that Cuba and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is communist-controlled.
Oswald demonstrated his cool proficiency as a propagandist when he switched the embarrassing question about his defection to Russia to an attempt to prove that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee was not communist-controlled. The next question came from Cuban refugee leader Carlos Bringuier.
I would like to know exactly the name of the organization that you represent here in the city, because I have some confusion. Is it Fair Play for Cuba Committee or Fair Play for Russia Committee?
Well, that is, of course, very provocative and question. I don't think it requires an answer.
Bringuier protested. He documented the economic havoc Castro had brought to Cuba. He said Oswald might represent a colony of Russia, but not the people of Cuba. Oswald answered,
well, in order to give a clear and concise and short answer to each of those, let's say questions, I would say that the facts and figures from a country like Pakistan or Burma would even reflect more light upon Cuba in relation to how many television sets and how many radios and all that. This I do not think is a subject to be discussed tonight. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee, as the name implies, is concerned primarily with Cuban-American relations.
Oswald complained that we were getting away from Cuban-American relations whenever we tried to pin him down. At this point in the program, the debate grew warmer. One of the moderators, WDSU newsman Bill Slatter, asked Oswald,
how many people do you have in your committee here in New Orleans?
I cannot reveal that as secretary of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee.
Is it a secret society?
No, Mr. Butler, it is not. However, it is a standard operating procedure for a political organization consisting of a political minority to safeguard the names and the number of its members.
Well, the Republicans are in the minority. I don't see them hiding their membership.
The Republicans are not the Republicans are a established political party representing a great many people. They represent no radical point of view. They do not have a very violent and sometimes emotional opposition as we do.
Oh, I see. Well, would you say then that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is not a communist-run organization?
The Senate subcommittees who have occupied themselves with investigating the Fair Play for Cuba Committee have found that there is nothing to connect the two committees. We have been investigated from several points of view, that is, points of view of taxes, allegiance, subversion, and so forth. The findings have been, as I say, absolutely zero.
That was simply not true. I produced these Senate documents which refer to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee as part of Castro's network in the United States. Oswald was on the spot, but he refused to be drawn into a position which would injure the Fair Play organization. When I asked him to name the honorary chairman of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, he professed ignorance.
The honorary chairman of this committee, the name of that person, I certainly don't know.
Well, let me tell you, in case you don't know about your own organization.
No, I know about it.
His name is Waldo Frank, and I'm quoting from the New Masses of September 1932. In that, the title of his article is How I Came to Communism, a Symposium, by Waldo Frank, Where I Stand and How I Got There. Then I asked Oswald about the secretary of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, identified as Joanne Grant, in hearings held before a subcommittee of the United States Senate. I had this picture of her serenading Chinese Communist boss Zhou Enlai. But Oswald talked instead about another Fair Play officer. Switching subjects is the oldest trick in the propagandist book. I had left myself wide open.
Well, we have a national director who is Mr. V.T. Lee, who has recently returned from Cuba, and because of the fact that the United States government has imposed restrictions on travel to Cuba, he is now under indictment for his traveling to Cuba. This, however, it's very convenient for rightist organizations to drag out this or that literature purporting to show a fact which has not been established in law. I've said that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee has definitely been investigated. That is very true. I've also said that the total result of that investigation was zero. That is, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is not now on the Attorney General's subversive list. Any other material you may have is superfluous.
Oswald could be extremely vague when it suited him, blurring and confusing the issue so that there was nothing but haze to attack. At one point, in just a few sentences, he spanned the world from Africa to Europe, then tried bringing in American foreign aid and alliances to prove his point. In response to Bill Slatter's question,
Mr. Oswald, if I may break in a moment, I believe it was mentioned that you at one time asked to renounce your American citizenship and become a citizen of the Soviet Union. Is that correct?
Well, I don't think that has a particular import to this discussion. We are discussing Cuban American.
Well, now, I think it has a bearing to this extent, Mr. Oswald. You say that Cuba is not dominated by Russia, and yet you apparently, by your own past actions, have shown that you have an affinity for Russia and perhaps communism, although I don't know that you admit that you either are a communist or have been. Could you straighten out that point? Are you or have you been a communist?
Well, I had answered that prior to this program on another radio program.
Are you a Marxist?
Yes, I am a Marxist.
what's the difference?
Well, the difference is primarily the difference between a country like Ghana, Guyana, Yugoslavia, China, or Russia. Very, very great differences. Differences which we appreciate by giving aid, let's say, to Yugoslavia in the sum of $100 million or so per year.
That's extraneous. What's the difference?
The difference is, as I said, a very great difference. Many parties, many countries are based on Marxism. Many countries, such as Great Britain, display very socialistic aspects and characteristics. I might point to the socialized medicine of Britain.
With one last implausible parallel, comparing Castroism with the socialized medicine in Britain, Oswald struck the final blow in the first round of the debate. But he had been on the ropes several times and had gone down for a shot count at least once with his admission,
Yes, I am a Marxist.
Again, Oswald was questioned about his defection to Russia. He denied any disloyalty, saying,
Well, the very obvious answer to that is that I'm back in the United States. A person who renounces his citizenship becomes legally disqualified for returning to the United States.
Then Bill Slatter asked Oswald how he expected to bring about what he called fair play for Cuba, knowing Castro's unpopularity. Oswald answered,
The principles of the fair play for Cuba consist of restoration of diplomatic, trade, and tourist relations with Cuba. That is one of our main points. We are for that. I disagree that this situation regarding American-Cuban relations is very unpopular. We are in a minority, surely. We are, however, not particularly interested in what Cuban exiles or rightist members of rightist organizations have to say. We are primarily interested in the attitude of the United States government toward Cuba. And in that way, we are striving to get the United States to adopt measures which would be more friendly toward the Cuban people and the new Cuban regime in that country. We are not at all communist controlled, regardless of the fact that I have the experience of living in Russia, regardless of the fact that we have been investigated, regardless of any of those facts. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee is an independent organization, not affiliated with any other organization. Our aims and our ideals are very clear and in the best keeping with American traditions of democracy.
Carlos Bringuier asked Oswald if he agreed with Fidel Castro's 26th of July speech when Castro called President John F. Kennedy a ruffian and a thief.
I would not agree with that particular wording. However, I and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee does think that the United States government, through certain agencies, namely the State Department and the CIA, has made monumental mistakes in its relations with Cuba. Mistakes which are pushing Cuba into the sphere of activity of, let's say, a very dogmatic communist country as China is.
Slatter asked Oswald if he agreed that the American people had once admired Castro. Oswald answered,
I would say that the activities of the United States government in regard to Batista were a manifestation of not so much support for Fidel Castro, but rather a withdrawal of support from Batista. In other words, we stopped armaments to Batista. What we should have done was to take those armaments and drop them into the Sierra Maestre, where Fidel Castro could have used them. As for public sentiment at that time, I think even at that time, even before the revolution, there were rumblings of official comment and so forth from government officials against Fidel Castro.
I closed the debate with a simple question. Why are the people in Cuba starving today? Oswald's answer was a perfect propaganda pitch.
Well, in any country emerging from a semi-colonial state and embarking upon reforms which require a diversification of agriculture, you're going to have shortages. After all, 80% of imports into the United States from Cuba were two products, tobacco and sugar. Nowadays, while Cuba is reducing its product as far as sugarcane goes, it is striving to grow unlimited and unheard of for Cuba quantities of certain vegetables, sweet potatoes, lima beans, cotton, and so forth, so that they can become agriculturally independent.
Gentlemen, I'll have to interrupt our time.
We didn't know it at the time, but Oswald was corresponding with top officials of the Communist Party USA. In this letter, dated August 28th and addressed to comrades on the Central Committee, Oswald began by asking for advice on a problem of personal tactics, and concluded, here in New Orleans, I'm secretary of the local branch of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a position which, frankly, I've used to foster communist ideals. On a local radio show, I was attacked by Cuban exile organization representatives for my residence, etc., in the Soviet Union. I feel I may have compromised the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, so you see that I need the advice of trusted, long-time fighters for progress. Please advise. With fraternal greetings, sincerely, Lee H. Oswald. Arnold Johnson, one of the leading communists in the United States, replied on September 19th and said the party would find some way of getting in touch with Oswald if he moved to Baltimore. The party itself turned these letters over to the FBI after the assassination. They are buried in the war on hearings. On August 21st, of course, we knew none of this. What was Oswald's motivation? What made him tick? Dr. Alton Ochsner, chief of the medical center in New Orleans, which bears his name, and former president of the American Cancer Society and president of INCA, explains how pro-Castro communist propaganda may have influenced Oswald.
One question which every American must ask and answer is not whether Oswald was ordered to act or acted alone, but whether communist propaganda incited his action. If it is true the communistic propaganda reached into the midst of America, got a grip on the mind of a young American boy, filled it with hatred for his country and its leaders, and thus manipulated his trigger finger by remote control, then there can be no question of communism's legal and moral guilt for President Kennedy's tragic death. So we must ask and ask again, was there a larger meaning and greater issues involved than the loathing hatred of a single individual? And finally, we must ask ourselves why Oswald picked on the President of the United States when he did. One clue is found in these statements of Fidel Castro, as quoted in the Miami Herald in September 1963, just after the Conversation Carte Blanche program was presented, 2 months before the President's assassination.
United States leaders should think that if they are aiding terrorist plans to eliminate Cuban leaders, they themselves will not be safe. Kennedy is the Batista of his time and the most opportunistic American president of all times.
Just 4 days before he died, in a speech before the Inter-American Society of Newspaper Editors, President Kennedy chose to ignore Castro's challenge. He attacked communism when he said,
"Communism is struggling to subvert and destroy the process of democratic development, to extend its rule to other nations of this hemisphere. If the alliance is to succeed, we must continue to support measures to halt communist infiltration and subversion, and to assist governments menaced from abroad. It is important to restate what now divides Cuba from my country and from the other countries of this hemisphere. It is the fact that a small band of conspirators has stripped the Cuban people of their freedom and handed over the independence and sovereignty of the Cuban nation to forces beyond the hemisphere. They have made Cuba a victim of foreign imperialism, an instrument of the policy of others, a weapon in an effort dictated by external powers to subvert the other American republics. This and this alone divides us. As long as this is true, nothing is possible. Without it, everything is possible."
4 days later, President Kennedy was dead. In the recreation of the significant parts of the WDSU radio program, Conversation Carte Blanche, what you heard was what the Warren Commission heard. The answers were Oswald's answers. The voice was Oswald's voice.